I would be lying if I told you either way.
They look amazing. I think you need to
Right?
post a picture of them when we get done.
I did. I
Okay.
just did.
Okay, awesome. Y'all need to make sure you go to Bridget's profile, Wing Gal, and look at her amazing crop of cantaloupes. And I can tell you firsthand, they taste like candy because she overnighted me some last year. So they're amazing. Um, I did want to take a second and just let you guys know I finished a book I'd been reading over the weekend, and I did take a prerogative of not going with either Dark Alliance or Legacy of Ashes. I will get to them, but I thought it was so important based on my kind of within the last several months rethinking the whole um, wiring diagram of where we've come. And I want to explain that. I know many of you have heard it, but we have new people every day. My kind of wiring diagram, if you call it that, is the pre World War II, post World War II, and today. And what we have discovered is that pre World War II, there were companies that employed their own intelligence and paramilitary capability to do business in foreign countries. And post World War II, this same international syndicate set up intelligence agencies and shifted the cost onto the taxpayers in all of the different countries. They also set up standing militaries to do paramilitary operations, again, at our expense. But starting around the 1990s, there become another phenomenon which was the creation of companies that did intelligence and paramilitary as private entities. And if you fast forward another 15 years, all of those smaller paramilitary intelligence capability got bought up by the same international syndicate that used to have them as an expense on their accounting books. So now not only are we paying for it, they now own these companies that are being contracted to the CIA and the military to go do the same work that they were doing. And because they are owned by the international syndicate, which I would argue there's always been a dotted line to the CIA, they are now literally owned by them, getting our taxpayer dollars to carry out missions that are beneficial to them. Because you can bet, whatever your paycheck happens to be next week, that Halliburton or DynCorp or any of these organizations are not going to do anything that does not benefit that corporation, even if it's contracted with the DoD or the CIA to do something different. It isn't going to happen. They are going to do what's in the best interest of those oligarchs. So I had this book. I just started reading it about 10 days ago. And it is one of the best books that lays out the chronology of this modern day paramilitary and intelligence capability that I've come across. And so I just think it's fitting in the line of the current kind of conversations that I've been having with you guys to delve into that aspect because it is not something that we have covered so far. We've covered a lot of the other stuff, and I do want to bring you those other books, which I will eventually do, that kind of add some color and other details to it. But we've not touched on this topic in any depth at all. So this book is by far the best one I've found. If you guys know of others, I would love for you to let me know what they are. So I'm going to give you kind of a brief overview of the first chapter or so, because it starts out with the story of a particular guy when he was a kid, and his name is, and I'll butcher this because it's Arabic, Kadhim Desmal Majid al Kananani. And the book starts out when he was 14 years old and talks about the turmoil that was going on in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and that his father had been kidnapped and tortured unmercifully by Saddam Hussein. And when he is returned to the family, he is a skeleton of his former self. So they scrape up enough money, him and some family members, to leave Iraq and go to Kuwait. Obviously, they had no idea that Saddam Hussein was going to invade Kuwait. They lived in Kuwait as refugees. So his mom ends up dying, and from tuberculosis. And his father insists that Kadhim go to America because he believed that education was the only way out of the situation that Kadhim found himself in. So in the interim, they leave Kuwait and they go to Saudi Arabia, again in a refugee camp. His father gets diagnosed with cancer. So he knows any minute he's going to be left on his own. So his father, and he eventually dies. Kadhim had never heard from him again after he goes to America seeking asylum. And he moved into a suburb of DC in Virginia in 1995. He worked as a carpenter and several other things. And he was watching the US Marines topple the statue of Saddam Hussein in central Baghdad. And of course, he was thrilled. He had not seen his brother. He didn't know whether he was dead or alive. And he decided at that minute that he was going to join the US Army. Now, again, he's an Arabic speaker, so high prize commodity in the military at the time. So he decides that he wants to be one of the special forces interpreters. He ends up at Fort Bragg in special forces training. And he was fluent in Farsi, Arabic, and English at this point. So he does really well in the training, and his first deployment is to Iraq. He receives several military awards, and everybody has nothing but good things to say about him. And it goes on to talk about, on another deployment in 2005, he was coming back from returning to the Baghdad airport, which is where a big camp was, from an all-day outing where he was doing interpretation for prisoners that were held by the Joint Coalition. They go through a checkpoint, and They all show their IDs and everything. The car ahead of them was at the checkpoint when they were there. So they were right behind the car ahead of them. The car ahead of them is now somewhat down the road. And obviously the driver in that car could see in his rearview mirror that they had stopped and been cleared and waved in to the green zone, the quote unquote safe zone. And they're just a little bit past the checkpoint when someone in the car in front of them opens the back door and starts firing on the U.S. Army vehicle that had just cleared. They were in a civilian sedan, but it was clear that they had been cleared into the green zone. So the car ahead of them opens the back door of like a van type vehicle and starts shooting at American soldiers. This guy's on active duty. And of the people in the car, he got hit in his foot. They can't stop the bleeding. And they find out that the car ahead of them is civilian contractors, not U.S. military. Civilian contractors paid by you and I to be over there that are shooting our military members. And so they eventually can't, there's medics in the vehicle with him, and because he was with a SOF team, and they always have a medic, and they can't get the bleeding to stop. So they end up turning around, leaving the green zone and going to the nearest hospital. His wound is so bad, and now it gets infected, that he was eventually transferred to another hospital ran by U.S. military, but they can't help him. He gets air evac to Landstuhl in Germany, and then eventually back to Walter Reed. Now, they were able to get part of the bullet out, but part of the bullet was not removable because it was too close to something that would have basically paralyzed his leg from the knee down. So he eventually gets medically discharged. So they totally destroyed his career. And he goes on to talk about how he was very familiar with Blackwater and DynCorp as part of these contractors that had been in Baghdad. And he makes it a quest to find out who exactly shot him. The book goes on to say that these civilian contractors would become indispensable to the Department of Defense, as well as the State Department, USAID, and the CIA. One of the Army generals said in a 2009 interview, the Pentagon has a new map, and on it are the private military companies. Or better said, perhaps, the family tree has a new branch. In August of 2011, a congressional commission that had studied private contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan for 3 years, in its final report said that there was the agencies, meaning the CIA and those who employed them, lacked the organic capacity to perform any function that would provide oversight, and it was forced to treat contractors as the default option. Into the 2010, 2020 timeframe, there was milestones in the privatization of war and national security. A congressional report in 2011 revealed a record-breaking surge in the use of private military and security contractors from 2009 to 2011 in Iraq and Afghanistan. This resulted in contractors outnumbering traditional troops on a 10-to-1 basis. They outnumbered State Department personnel present on an 18-to-1 and USAID workers on 100-to-1. But they are the three entities that were contracting the use of these people. And that's actually very interesting because of course, we know in the lead up to 2011, the CIA was planning the overthrow of the Arab Spring, several different countries that we overthrew. And that documents the buildup of primarily not military, private military companies, as well as intelligence arms. She also includes several other government entities that had began the use of large amounts of civilian contractors as well. So the whole downsizing was all smoke and mirrors. There was never a downsizing of any government entity. What they were doing was shifting the footprint from government workers to government contractors. That's kind of the gist of it. How big the industry of private military and security companies had become and how fast it was growing was not being looked at by anyone. Basic facts such as annual revenue is difficult to assess since many of them are private. There are government estimates that during that period of time, expenditures rose from $50 billion to $250 billion on these services alone. One study of 585 private military security companies noted that 43 were publicly traded, the rest were private. And what I've noticed in the books is things like Blackwater starts out as private and then it gets bought up by one of the corporate entities. And this is a planned accession. So they recruit special operators off of active duty, give them quote unquote loans to create companies that are private military companies. And as they begin hiring people and training them, they get bought up by one of the corporate giants. And that's kind of like their payout for doing it, because they pay outrageous sums. Even to estimate the number of private military security companies, whether in the United States or UK, and we're going to talk a lot about the UK, is a challenge. New ones pop up. They're swallowed up through acquisitions. Sometimes they will change their name in order, if they get involved in an incident, that company closes and another one, sometimes even at the same address, gets opened and they just continue doing business so that whatever their incident isn't associated with the new company. For a single U.S. contract, there could be as many as 5 layers of subcontractors. It's a massive web in order to deflect. They work, and the subcontractors, by the way, this is a whole nother aspect of this. You guys remember back, for those of you who've been with me for a long time, do you guys remember when we were doing Columbia, we stumbled across the fact that the CIA and Southcom, Southern Command, which takes over all of the Southern Hemisphere, had an estimated 20,000 paramilitary that they rented out for NATO operations and the UN. Well, guess what happens to those? They become subcontractors and are hired by these private companies. So they are literally using the US military to train these paramilitary under the guise of drug control or whatever. And then those people, because they're all civilians, those people become part of the recruiting pool for these mega corporations. They're rent-a-terrorist under the guise of a government contract. And in one study, they found that they came from Africa, South Asia, Latin America, including India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Philippines, Colombia, Chile, and Uganda. And what do all of those have in common? We've talked about every single one of them as CIA places where they set up paramilitary terrorist training camps in order to destabilize that country or a nearby country. Every single one of them. That's not a coincidence. Okay, so that basically is the prelude into the book. So it's just kind of setting the tone. The first chapter starts out in London. We're not surprised. And they're talking about a place in London that has a door knocker on the house that's the head of a lion. There's a keypad security entry and about 1 billion cameras from across the street, on the top of across the street, on their building, from every angle around this front door. There's massive security. So normally, day and night, all times of the day and night, there's a clerk that sits behind a counter on the inside of the door. And that little reception area has more cameras in it than they had outside. The clerk watches all of the cameras. There's a two-way mirror in the lobby for people who are also watching security cameras. On the wall is 24 mailboxes labeled A through XYZ. They have no names. And on a plaque where you hang your coats, it says cloaks and daggers only. What is this building? So, this building houses a club that is for England's elite special forces club. Yeah. Since the club's inception, weirdly enough, in 1945, you know, when they were launching Operation Gladio, the British monarchy has leased the building for £1 British pound a year. The British monarchy leases the building. Supposedly as a tribute to all of their special forces during World War II. On its wall is its story, at least part of it. There's the very first picture is Winston Churchill. There are pictures of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, which ran their Operation Gladio program. And they have pictures of a variety of the people that were part of that. One of which is Lieutenant Colonel Sir Archibald David Stirling, who in response to Churchill devised a plan to send what we now know to be stay-behind units into Germany. Their motto was, "Who dares wins." That's on the picture of Sterling in this residence. There is also a gold figurine of a winged dagger, which is the SAS emblem. There's also a picture of Wild Bill Donovan on the wall. The club members have included Frederick Forsyth, who wrote The Day of the Jekyll and Dogs of War. And also members are Peter and Ian Fleming, of course.
What was the name of the club again?
The Special Forces Club. The Special Forces is not part of a military establishment, although most of its members are former military from both Britain and the US. The membership is open to anyone that is considered Special Forces. Despite its guarded customs of secrecy, the Special Forces Club appears at first to simply be a social club, steeped in history, filled with the dusty trophies and old photos, and frequented by people who seem to be up from the country to meet friends and have luncheons. In its drawing room, tea and scones seem more appropriate than hidden recording devices, but they are there. In the inside of the club, it might be deceptive, but it has been used for meetings to discuss things like paramilitary. The club's highly confidential membership list is proof of that. It is known to include the names of former British and American intelligence agents from the CIA, British MI6, as well as professional kidnap negotiators, bombs and weapons experts. There are elderly members who are veterans, some of the Jedburghs. There are younger members, many in the current special forces, from Iraq and Afghanistan. There is a large contingent of middle-aged special forces, mainly SAS, and many of them have went on to create private military and security companies. For years, the Special Forces Club seemed more about the past than the present, but with new wars and intervention, that changed. Although often called new wars, the asymmetrical conflicts employing unconventional operatives was not new to the history of warfare. In Africa, low-intensity, local, intrastate battles have been ongoing in countries like Angola for 30 years. And of course, we've talked about Angola for a long time. But also in Somalia and Sudan, which we talked about. What's new was the extent to which the global shift to asymmetrical wars and conflicts and the demand for military and special forces that it created. During the first decade of the 21st century, the ever-widening span of unconventional warfare caused an unprecedented call for experts in special operations, intelligence, and security. At the same time, such a need created an unsettling gap between the militaries of nation states when wars not declared. Filling the gap in the marketplace of conflict was a big business opportunity, one that was met both in the United States and the UK. At the Special Forces Club, the new wars and private contractors were more than the stuff of drawing room conversations, as many private military and security companies had evolved out of the special forces ranks. Decades old British companies were often modeled for new firms, so often the Special Forces Club became what one club member called one of the centers of gravity of this new cottage industry. In UK, they refer to this new cottage industry as the circuit. The common ground, like in electricity, of the traditional and privatized military and security forces was the SAS, which, operating outside the established military, was one of the toughest, smartest, and most sophisticated of all special forces, accountable only to the monarch, not the prime minister, not the Ministry of War, but to the monarch. Although known for such counterterrorism expertise, the SAS was rarely identified as a pioneer in the privatization of security and defense. Yet former SAS soldiers and officers had been cultivating the marketplace of soldiering services long before other groups and individuals even knew it was an opportunity. The firms that laid the groundwork for the corporate evolution of mercenary trades were, in fact, founded by special forces operatives, most often with SAS experience. Such highly trained, unconventional former soldiers launched a new mercenary era in the early years of the Cold War. The companies they founded, rooted as they were in the covert culture of special forces, were part of an underworld of private security, defense, and aggression. They conjured up images of gun smuggling soldiers of fortune and were especially busy in Africa and Latin America, as we know. In the employ of multinational corporations and under the command at arm's length of the CIA and MI6, among others, they were well paid for toppling regimes, reinstating exiled leaders that the West preferred, or installing military dictatorships, eliminating rebel groups to safeguard their clients' control of highly prized reserves of gold, diamonds, copper, and oil. Dang, does that sound familiar? These companies were the modern day representatives of one of the world's oldest and most deplored professions, mercenaries. Kings had used mercenaries to defend their kingdoms, dictators to protect their rule, churches to guard worldly properties, and empires to expand their boundaries militarily. They had sparked battles and perpetuated wars, and when diplomacy failed, or the willing soldiers of a patriotic citizenry was not strong enough to defend the nation, mercenaries always surface. In their new incarnation, during the first decade of the Cold War, there were two companies that would qualify as the charter firms of this growing business. The first of numerous companies founded, led, and directed by former SAS operatives. One was called WatchGuard International. It was started by SAS founder David Sterling. So the same guy that created their basically special forces goes on to set up the beginnings of these paramilitary private military companies, WatchGuard International. The other, and this is such a weird name, Keenie, Keenie, Meanie, MEENIE, Keeny Meeny Services. We're going to refer to that as KMS. It was also started by a guy that worked for Sterling as a former SAS lieutenant colonel. WatchGuard's specialties included training teams of bodyguards for heads of state in high-risk places, primarily in Africa, because they're cooing everybody down there at this time, and training local military forces to combat and eliminate rebel forces. And by rebel forces, they're talking about the people resisting the new government that the West installs. On its list of clients were most of the rulers of Gulf states and several of the African states. Under contract with the Saudis in the 1960s, WatchGuard hired the mercenaries who waged a guerrilla war against the Egyptian-backed North Yemeni government in the Yemeni Civil War. So let's stop right there. I spent like an entire show on Alpha Warrior explaining to you guys the history of Yemen and how what they refer to as the Hutsis, which are actually the indigenous people, had been crunched from Saudi Arabia on the north, the UAE on the east, and the British from the south. They're actually the citizens of that country, not these other three surrounding, two surrounding and one from way up north, being the UK. And WatchGuard hired mercenaries on behalf of the British to wage what we were told was a civil war. It wasn't a civil war at all. It was an attack on a sovereign country by the British using mercenaries. A few years later, and keep in mind, by the way, the 1960s, isn't that exactly the same? Oh, yes, it is. These are the guys that started that civil war in Yemen because they knew Nasser in Egypt would send his military to Yemen. 75,000 people from Egypt deployed to Yemen to help the Yemeni against the UK when they were attacked from the west by Israel. 6-day war, the attempted sinking of the USS Liberty. That's why understanding history, when you read these books, are so important. So this is yet another element of history that wasn't covered in any of the other books that we've read about all of that. They're documenting the fact that the British used mercenaries to draw the Egyptians into Yemen so that they could leave the west part of Egypt vulnerable to the Israeli attack, which happened. But what we were told was the Egyptian army was going to attack Israel imminently, and they just launched a pre-attack because they were going to get attacked anyway. And that's a bold-faced lie. So, little history there. A few years later, WatchGuard personnel planned an elaborate coup to overthrow Libya Gaddafi. Weird. Shortly after WatchGuard folded in the 1970s, Lieutenant Colonel Sterling revealed the firm's mission in a British TV interview. Quote, "The organization was designed to tackle really important military objectives, which could not be tackled officially because of questions they would raise in the House of Commons. The British government wanted a reliable organization without any direct identification. They wanted bodyguards trained for rulers whom they wanted to survive." Unquote. That's the very definition of plausible deniability. The Queen and her SAS is contracting out people to protect the leaders that they want to do business with and overthrow the regimes of the people they don't want to do business with. How more international syndicate gladio can you get? I was jaw dropped when I read that. Close to the time of WatchGuard's inception, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Johnson, then working as a broker for Lloyd's of London, started KMS, Keeny Meeny Services. And I do need to say this. Keeny Meeny comes from a Swahili word meaning the motion of a snake in tall grass. How more fitting. With Johnson's tie to Lloyd's, KMS was the first company to link the insurance business and the private military companies, a partnership that profitably would identify dangerous regions and peddle security. So just sit back and take a second. Lloyd's of London is an insurance company. Think AIG, think CV Star, think of all of the insurance companies that we've talked about over the last 2.5 years. So the guy working at Lloyd's of London creates his own private military organization. Now, do you not think that he still communicates with Lloyd's of London? Of course he does. He's working for Lloyd's of London. And Lloyd's of London knows where all of the operations are going to happen because they're directly linked. At KMS, which focused on the training of mercenaries and bodyguards, SAS veterans filled all of the top leadership posts. In the 1980s, it stood out among its peers for its work with the CIA in Nicaragua. 1980s, the Iran-Contra had Keeny Meeny Services working with the Contras to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. KMS, for example, supplied pilots for clandestine airdrops in support of the Contras. The SAS Lloyd's connection inspired the creation of yet another one called Control Risk Group. It doesn't get any clearer than that. Control Risk Group. It was founded in the early 70s. At the time, airplane hijacking and kidnappings were on the rise, and the word terrorism was beginning to be tossed around. It would appear in annual reports of natural resources and oil companies operating in high-risk territories where rebel forces had fought back against them. So mining companies and oil companies operating in territories where they were no longer welcomed. All of a sudden, we start hearing the word terrorism. Such companies recognized that their own government were not always going to be equipped to protect them. A recent Oxford grad, Julian Radcliffe, with a degree in philosophy and a relatively brief stint at the SAS, designed Controlled Risk Group to fill that gap for businesses venturing into hostile environments. And it's not ironic that it's an Oxford grad because we know Oxford is the breeding ground for MI6. The firm would specialize in kidnap negotiations. At a time when unprecedented numbers of Americans were traveling, working, and living abroad, he defined a niche market designed to grow because they make it grow. His plan was to recruit former SAS men to provide hostage-related services as part of Lloyd's kidnap and ransom insurance package. So I wonder how many of these kidnappings were actually staged and how much money laundering went on. Just a thought. It's just crazy. The kidnapping and ransom policy, as it was called, K&R, covered the expense of a ransom payment if a ransom payment had to be paid, and included the cost of highly trained SAS experts sent immediately to the location of the kidnapping. Radcliffe's first crew consisted of 4 former SAS officers. One of the most renowned offshoots of the SAS, however, was a company that I'm sure most of you have heard of, Executive Outcomes, a company that originated in apartheid South Africa and became the model firm in the late 20th century for evolving phenomenon of private military companies. We're going to talk about it a lot more. Executive Outcomes, as it was typically referred to, EO, was founded in 1989 by Eben Barlow, a former officer in the apartheid era highly decorated combat unit called the 32 Buffalo Battalion. Barlow had also been a leader in South Africa's Civil Cooperation Bureau, notorious for trying to destroy the anti-apartheid movement and for assisting apartheid companies in averting anti-apartheid sanctions imposed by the UN and other countries. In other words, they're the ones that helped everybody get around all of the don't trade with apartheid South Africa. 4 years after starting Executive Outcomes in South Africa, Barlow collaborated with a former SAS commander and another Special Forces veteran who ran a fast-growing oil business to establish the UK version of Executive Outcomes. The Executive Outcome logo in both nations was a chessboard knight, which represented the paladin, a freelance warrior for justice and virtue. Executive Outcomes soon operated in at least 10 African nations. The firm would occasionally provide security services to a company or a government trying to defeat a rebel group that had taken over gold mines or oil rigs, and in exchange, it would receive a lien on future productions of the mineral wealth of the client country. So they're getting rich off of putting down honest rebellions, trying to kick out the people who are employing Executive Outcome out of their country from stealing their resources. So they go in and put down the rebellion, trying to kick out the Western oligarchs and then take a share of what wealth comes out of that country. Isn't that a convenient setup? Executive Outcome employed over 3,000 people by the 1990s, close to 500 military officers, many from the SAS teams, some from South African Special Forces. Then, after Nelson Mandela's South African government passed an anti-mercenary law in 1998, Executive Outcome shut down in South Africa, but not in the UK. In the UK, Executive Outcome was part of the London-based conglomerate of private military firms, mineral resource building businesses, and air charter companies. You know, like their own private CIA. Among its holdings would soon be a company called Sandline International, run by some of the same ex-military men and businessmen who had backed and operated the UK Executive Outcomes. Sandline's CEO, Tim Spicer, who we're going to talk about a lot, would become a highly influential and hugely controversial figure in the private military security industry. After the Cold War ended, companies like these grew in size and services both in the US and the UK as, as the militaries were downsized. They then hired those people downsized. In the 1990s, companies employing former soldiers, spies, and special agents helped to meet the demand. Like the US, increasingly involved in regional conflicts that had once been alliances. Just 2 years into the post-Cold War era, as scholar Deborah Avent wrote, quote, a rash of smaller scale conflicts unleashed disorder and demands for intervention. As the clamor for a Western response grew, just at the same time as Western militaries were shrinking. Private military security companies provided a tool for meeting greater demands with smaller forces, unquote. That's convenient. So I'm going to go over and start a conflict by disrupting USAID, by disrupting the unions and the governments of these foreign countries. And the guy, like the same company that owns DynCorp and some of these other larger private military, they also own private military. They are a private military. So my Halliburton buddy wants access to this mine and I'm getting kicked out of this country. So I'm going to go over there and create a conflict. And then I get to send in my own paramilitary to resolve the conflict that I just started. Just so you guys get the Reader's Digest version. During that time, the American private military security business could be divided into three parts. There were the new firms popping up to meet the post-Cold War demand. There were a few older companies that had been contracted for military service in past wars. These included Booz Allen, which provided training in South Vietnam as part of Operation Phoenix. And there were large, well-established defense contractors, the makers of weapons, airplanes, and defense equipment, that they sell to themselves to go take care of this stuff, which were adapting to this new market. When British private military security were rooted in the skills of military elite and special forces, the American firms often came out of the war product industry moving into services. These were the sort of companies that inspired caution. Among them were Brown and Root Services Corporation, the construction and engineering subsidiary of Halliburton. Now, what's really interesting about that is, where did we find the PSSI, the public safety organization that took over from Office of Public Safety? Well, oh my gosh, they were bought out by Brown and Root. Do you see how all of this is connected? All of this is connected. That's just crazy. Brown and Root's experience building oil rigs in remote, hostile environments and undeveloped nations led the groundwork for its role in American foreign policy, one that continued to grow. Crucial to understanding the American push to privatization is what is known as LOGCAP, LOGCAP. It's a U.S. Army logistics civil augmentation program. While product-based American firms moved into the realm of wartime services, partly because of the expanding defense markets in the 1990s. LOGCAP was actually a bigger catalyst. Beginning in 1985, it was effectively the U.S. military's experiment in relying on private firms for logistic services. And for those of you who don't know that word, it's the supply lines. It was also part of the total force policy, which, oh my God, was the stupidest thing I've ever seen, which was enacted in 1973 at the behest of Army Chief of Staff Creighton Abrams. As the U.S. commander for the last 4 years of the Vietnam War, Abrams was devastated by the protests and negative public sentiment when his troops returned home. Abrams' doctrine was a way to prevent a disconnect from the public and the military, as it required our all reserve military to be equipped with the same capability as the reserve. And just so that you guys know this, kind of the not logic, but during Vietnam, the military Department of Defense went directly to a draft as opposed to mobilizing Guard and Reserve. Now, they did that on purpose. They knew, because in order to mobilize the Guard and Reserve, at least back then, it's completely changed now, there would have to be a declaration of war. And they somehow convinced everybody that that wasn't a good idea, that we could just start using the draft without a declaration of war. And part of the excuse that was given of why we needed a draft versus Guard and Reserve is because the Army had not provided, trained, and equipped their Guard and Reserve to the same standards as the Army. And they basically said, if we have to train everybody, then let's just do a draft. The Air Force, for as long as I've known, as I've been in it since the 1970s, up to, and sometimes over, 50% of the airlift missions in the Air Force have always been flown by the Guard and Reserve with their own planes. There has never been a training difference between, in the Air Force, Guard, Reserve, active duty. Now, in some cases, the Air Force had tried many times to get rid of the A-10, so they weren't equipping them with up-to-date, like communication systems to talk to the ground forces as the Army progressed with their communications capability. And so the Guard and Reserve got together and went directly to Congress and got a special appropriations, because the preponderance of the A-10s by that point had been in the Guard and Reserve. And they got their own line item to do their own R&D to upgrade A-10s, which, of course, once they did that, the active duty had to do it, because then the active duty couldn't deploy with the Army guys because they'd have been the odd man out. So sometimes, at least in the Air Force, the Guard and Reserve has actually led the active duty. That has never been the case with the Army. And so I just wanted to explain a little bit about the need of something like the Abrams Doctrine, because it forced the Army to begin, and they still didn't do a really good job of it, of keeping their Guard and Reserve on the same capability standards. Excuse me. Okay. So, though it came into existence in 1985 under Ronald Reagan, LOGCAP did not come into play until the end of the administration of George H.W. Bush. In 1992, Dick Cheney, soon to be the Halliburton CEO, commissioned Halliburton, Brown and Root. So he's going to be in charge of that company. He's been associated with that company. He just temporarily became the SecDef, and then he asked that company to study the potential advantages of privatizing more of the duties involved in the military support. So he's going to contract out everything and then whip around the corner and be in the seat and get rich off the contracting out of that stuff, just so you guys are staying up. Brown and Root gave privatization a thumbs up and then was awarded the first ever 5-year LOGCAP contract allowing the firm to run support operations for the U.S. military in Haiti, Somalia, Balkans, Kuwait, among others. So, his reward, Dick Cheney's, for getting Halliburton the job was he gets to be the CEO. Under the leadership of President Bill Clinton, LOGCAP spurred what could easily be called the first bonanza for private military business in the Balkans. And by the end of the Clintons' two terms, private military expenditures had grown from hundreds of millions to billions. It was in the Balkans in the 1990s that the US politicians from both parties began to fully appreciate this value of using private military because it gives them plausible deniability. In the aftermath of the Cold War, in what was the former Yugoslavia, a civil war broke out between the Serbs and the Croatians and Bosnians. Now, keep in mind, we've talked about this a long time ago. That was all instigated. This is the Gladio forces pumping in a bunch of Islamics, terrorists that they had trained in Afghanistan into the former Yugoslavia to create the havoc. This entire thing was man-made by the West. And in April 1992, it erupted into a humanitarian crisis as the Serbs, under this book's label, slaughtered a bunch of Muslims. But keep in mind, those Muslims, in large part, was imported from Afghanistan and the trained CIA terrorists in to start this war. But the narrative became the Muslims are being slaughtered. That was not the case. The indigenous people were fighting against Islamic terrorists trained by the CIA that had been flown into their country. But we now have our narrative that we need in order to blow up the private military industrial system. Bill Clinton vowed to take action. The new president faced many obstacles: a downsizing and overextended military on purpose, a nation's interest only in domestic interest, and a 1991 UN embargo on arms sales to anyone. Although airstrikes were an option, many people, to include John McCain, said airstrikes without ground forces would be worthless. You know, because we're all pro-war, just send in the ground guys. And of course, General Powell was on board with that because he's Army. Got to have the ground forces. Adding to complications were two recent events: America's failed intervention in Somalia in 1993 and the 100 days of genocide in Rwanda in 1994. How is it possible that the US was going to make an aggressive move to end the devastation in the Balkans without creating political turmoil? Because they didn't do anything when it was blacks, but now you've got Eastern Europeans. The solution came out of a convergence of influence. In 1994, the Minister of Defense in Croatia sought help and mentioned the use of private military executives with past military experience as a way to bridge the gap. They called this, they wanted to enlist Military Professional Resources Incorporated. This was a company known among insiders as Americans Professional Army. And author Robert Young Pelton referred to it as, quote, the politically correct version of a private military company, unquote. It described itself as the greatest corporate assemblage of military expertise in the world. MPRI, Military Professional Resources Incorporated, was one of the first American private military security companies to be founded by retired general officers and to follow the SAS model, with services ranging from modernizing and training national armies to purchasing arms. It had opened its main offices right down the road from the Pentagon. How convenient. And they did it during the Reagan administration. And now, MPRI, as it had been a weapon hidden in some dark place, would be the solution to Clinton's predicament in the Balkans. MPRI would supply 46,000 rifles, 1,000 machine guns, and hundreds of armored vehicles to the Croatian army, which it would also train. That's convenient. You know, it's those people over there. It's not the military. I don't have anything to do with that company over there. With US approval and some backing, MPRI in the early 1995 helped to build a Croatian army into a force that by the fall of that same year had pushed Serbian Milosevic into peace negotiations. After the Dayton Peace Accords, Clinton again turned to the private sector, this time because of US commitment of 20,000 peacekeepers to an international force in Bosnia. By then, there had been analysis beyond Brown and Root showing that the advantages of privatizing logistics support was perfect. To be sure, the occasion of the US-led NATO forces in Bosnia was the unveiling of log cap in reality. Instead of calling up thousands of reservists to go to Bosnia and Herzegovina, the US government contracted it all out. It's like it's not happening. Virginia-based DynCorp and Brown and Root participated. Such a strategy removed the political messiness of allowing the US to continue its presence in the Balkans for years on end. Few Americans were even aware it was happening. As author and Brookings Institute fellow Peter Singer later wrote, quote, "The privatization effort was one of the quiet triumphs of the war," unquote. Log cap was successful enough to prompt strategies of outsourcing a vast array of other stuff, you know, like intelligence, air transport, armed security, even interrogations. And so it was that the logistics support jump-started the privatization trend at the Pentagon. Perhaps as significant to the industry development in the 1990s was an even less visible drive to rebrand the images of the dogs of war. As a new age of uncertainty and instability unfolded, the markets for private forces grew. Some smart players in the new mercenary market included a few members of the Special Forces Club. They began to pay closer attention to public image and initiated an unofficial campaign to ban the use of the word mercenary and make sure that they use a PR team to help them paint themselves as patriots instead of mercenaries. And we will cover that tomorrow. All right. That's it for today.
So, question. This would essentially be a great way if you wanted to start a war and suppress the people without having to go through Congress, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's what I thought. I mean, just everything. It just.
Well, what's interesting about it is they can go hired by a company. Let's just say Anaconda Mining in Chile. So Anaconda Mining, that was going to be kicked out of Chile in the early 1970s by President Allende. So these private military companies can be hired by Anaconda Mining to go down in conjunction with the CIA, of course, and destroy all kinds of resistance efforts. And then in the aftermath of the assassination of Allende, the same company gets a contract from the military to go down, or USAID or the CIA, to go down and train the DINA. So they're going to set up this paramilitary capability to thwart all of the quote unquote rebels that were Allende supporters, and their president was just assassinated, and they're out in the streets protesting because they don't want a military dictatorship. They don't want General Pinochet to be in charge of their country. They had an election. They want the guy that they elected. And if you killed them, they want another election. So these private military guys are the one that caused the crap. And then they supply the people to come in and train the actual terrorists that just took over their government to put down the patriots in the country, so they can literally go in and start a war and be the ones that are profiting from the war they started. Miles, go ahead.
Sorry.
That's okay. I'll come right back to you, Bridget. Miles, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Colonel. Do you mind if I give some historical context to one of the entities that is in the book?
No, if it's something we covered.
Yeah. So I'll just read through this real quick. Lloyd's of London traces its origins to Edward Lloyd's Coffee House, first reference in 1688 on Tower Street in London. When it opened, it was not yet an insurance market, but a coffee house catering to sailors, merchants, and ship owners. Edward Lloyd provided reliable shipping news, making it a hub for a maritime intelligence.
Yep.
This environment fostered informal business dealings where merchants and bankers began underwriting marine insurance. They would gather and share information about voyages, cargoes, and the risk, and the bankers started writing their names under voyages detailed on a blackboard, agreeing to financially back ships' cargoes against loss at sea, hence the term underwriting. This marked the early beginnings of what would become Lloyd's insurance market. By 1691, a small group of marine insurers moved to Lombard Street, further solidifying the coffee house role as a place for obtaining marine insurance. Those early activities centered on facilitating marine insurance, though face-to-face negotiations leveraging the coffee house's reputation as a reliable source of shipping news. It also became a meeting place for those involved in maritime trading, including a controversial those of slave trade, insuring the ships and enslaved people, a role for which Lloyd's later apologized. The formal insurance market began to take shape later with a committee formed in 1771 and the Societies of Lloyd's established in 1774 at the Royal Exchange. But its earliest days, it catered to a space for maritime business and insurance transactions. Thank you, Colonel.
Sure. And their big thing was opium as well as slaves. So, Bridget, go ahead. What else were you going to say?
One little addendum to what you were talking about, log cap.
Yeah.
AMC awarded log cap 3, the third contract, to KBR in 2001. Log cap 3 primarily supported the, quote, global war on terror.
You faded out. Bridget, we can't hear you. Try that again. No, I can't hear you. I'm going to bring Stellar up before I take you down. Hold on just a second.
Colonel, you know, I used to be really shy about reading in front of people.
Well, you're not anymore. All right. Bridget, try talking now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
AMC awarded LogCAP 3, the third contract to KBR in 2001. LogCAP 3 primarily supported the global war on terrorism.
Yeah. And AMC is Air Mobility Command. That was the air side. Yeah.
Insane.
Yeah. I don't know how to say your name. You are so mad, I assume.
Thank you for letting me speak. I have 2 questions for you.
Sure.
I feel very privileged actually talking to you. So I have 2 questions. One is, why was the U.S. Army Special Forces used in Kosovo? And what was the reason for the elimination of Milosevic? And I believe that was in 2006.
So there was no U.S. Army Special Forces, to my knowledge, on the ground there. As a matter of fact, one of the big I was actually in Italy when that whole thing kicked off. Our base in southern Italy was the reception of forces for the search and rescue teams and a whole bunch of the special operators, but they were actually in Italy. I'm
going to have to push back on that because I actually know of a special forces group that was in there. I know someone personally who was in Kosovo.
Okay, so I'm not saying they weren't. I'm telling you officially there were not, because one of the big kind of it went on for years. One of the big problems was, and I'm just going to tell you guys a little bit of inside baseball here. The Air Force rarely would get to be a combatant commander because of the use, primarily using ground forces. So the Air Force got to be U.S. Space Command, or they got to be Cyber Commander, or the functional unified commands, but rarely were they ever selected to be a geographical combatant commander because of their lack of ground war strategy, blah, blah, blah. In NATO at the time, which that was a NATO operation, General Wesley Clark, Air Force General, was one of the first. No, he's Army. What am I thinking? His air deputy convinced Wesley Clark, who was Army, NATO commander, that the air component could do the, and I'm trying to remember that guy's name, could do the air operations and with A-10s, F-16s, F-15s, and basically just bomb the hell out of that area and bring Milosevic to the table. And so officially, and that's all I'm talking about, officially, there were CIA there. I'm not at all surprised that there were soft guys there, because out of JSOC at Fort Bragg, there is a component that does not report to the Department of Defense. They are basically assigned directly to the president, and they operate out of the National Security Council. And a lot of people don't realize that their real line. So officially, from the Department of Defense, they did not have ground forces there. But would I be at all shocked that JSOC did? Because they did not get tasked through the normal tasking for ground forces for that operation. What was your second question?
What would be the reason why they would eliminate Milosevic in 2006?
Milosevic, from what I've read, was pushing back against NATO and the West and was a nationalist. And they wanted to get rid of him. 100% they wanted to get rid of him. Just like they got rid of every single nationalist that was not NATO friendly. And the way they got rid of him, as I just articulated, was they took Muslims that they being the CIA had trained out of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan, and imported them as part of the quote unquote Muslim population. They were not indigenous to that area at all for decades and decades before that. The Muslim, Christian, and everybody else had lived there happily together and had never had this type of strife. It was not organic. It was manipulated in order to take Milosevic out.
Okay, because the question, so is it possible that the special forces guys that were sent there had no idea why they were sent there?
So here's the problem. And I've said this repeatedly, and I'm not taking up for the military. At the general officer level, there's no excuse for any of it. But here's the problem. Located at Fort Bragg with JSOC is the CIA. Now, if you fast forward to today, the CIA is feeding manipulated intelligence. We just had that front and center from John Radcliffe, right? So they knew that the Russians were interfering on Hillary's behalf, not Trump's. They manipulated the intelligence to say what they wanted it to say. They provide it to the media by quote unquote leaks. And then the entire operation goes down that President Trump is a Russian stooge. He's an agent of Putin. And they tried to mobilize the entire American people to be anti-Trump. That's exactly what they did in Yugoslavia. And another thing, if you're newer, the way that they get people into NATO, they knew they would never get Yugoslavia into NATO, ever. Could they break it up and get each little part if they control the new leadership of the broken up countries? You have only to look at Korea. They knew they could not knock out the North, so they just separate it. They break it up. And they have completely controlled South Korea ever since. Same thing with Vietnam. They knew there was no way that they were ever going to defeat Ho Chi Minh. So they just break it up. And this has happened over and over and over again in the history. And it's not just post-World War II. They did the exact same thing with Panama. They basically stole it from Colombia. This is an ongoing way of control.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for asking. It's a shocker when people that you know have gone there and went there under a false pretense.
Correct.
Of thinking that they were saving up.
Correct.
And then they had no idea what they were doing. And then
Correct.
To eliminate Milosevic, and I believe it was through poison or something. It was very shady how
Yes.
he died. I
Yes.
think he was in jail
Yes.
at the time, awaiting trial.
It's always shady. And the special forces have went into, and there's, I mean, I have so many examples of this. The way this is manipulated is that prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a national action memorandum that the labeling of anyone a communist allowed for a finding by the president to assassinate them. And so all you have to do is label someone. After the late 80s, early 90s, that was amended to the word terrorist. So all you have to do is label them a terrorist, which they did, and then they become a target. Now, all of the intelligence is going to report officially that someone has been labeled a communist. And here's how easy that is to do. In the case of the Congo, they basically surrounded Patrice Lumumba and economically cut him off, militarily cut him off, politically, he was an outcast. So he has no ability to get money, weapons, or anything while he is actively being attacked out of the area of Katanga, which again had been manipulated, and a quote unquote civil war started, all done by Otto Skorzeny, a former Nazi, in the 60s. And they immediately announced that Katanga, under the control of NATO, is going to succeed from the Congo. And they literally were inserting from Katanga, a NATO base, operatives into the Congo to create trouble. So he's completely isolated. He's completely cut off. The only country he can call to get weapons to defend the Congolese people that are being mass murdered was the Soviet Union. And as soon as he made that phone call, he's labeled a communist and he was murdered. They did the exact same thing to Chile. As a matter of fact, Kissinger is quoted as saying, "Make the economy scream," in Chile. This has been done repeatedly. They did it in Iran. They called Mossadegh a communist. It was done in Guatemala over and over and over again.
So I'm assuming that everything that we know about Somalia is not what it seems to be either.
Nothing about history is true. Everything we've been fed. So with that in mind, if you are a military member and you are deployed to the Congo and you are told that Patrice Lumumba is a communist and you have to take him out, then if you're trained in special forces, you're going to go take him out. The same thing in Chile, the same thing in Guatemala. And what's most interesting about all of this is you fast forward 40, 30, 40, 50 years, there will be declassified CIA and State Department memorandums, cables that went back and forth through analysts in the country that says the Guatemalan president wasn't communist. There's no communist anywhere around here. They did the exact same thing in Brazil, by the way, in the 1960s. There's no communists here. There's labor that want a fair wage from the U.S. corporations in Brazil or Guatemala or whatever, and they have organized, but then the CIA infiltrates people into these movements, and it's them that come back and say, oh my God, they're communist. And so you have a divergence of quote unquote intelligence where underlings, the analysts are going, they're not communists. There's not even a communist in the country. There's no communication with the Soviet Union. There's nothing. But yet they were labeled a communist. Now, we were programmed from the 1940s on that we have to hate the communists. They're the evil bastards that are going to come over here any day and kill all of us. And so if you are programmed with those talking points and you're special forces and you're given a gun and you're told you're deploying to a country that has a communist or a terrorist in it, you're going to take them out. And that's exactly what has happened over and over and over again. There is nothing the CIA has ever done that is legitimate.
This is so painful to hear.
You? I was part of it. I'm the one that deployed to Iraq. I know how painful it is. It's gut-wrenching.
People that have been lost. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to drop down.
Okay. All along, go ahead.
Hi, Colonel. I just wanted to point out with regard to the Yugoslavia breakup, I think you're right on target here. You compare it with other places where, it was impossible for the U.S. to coerce the organization into their NATO or NATO or what have you. Then they just crumbled the cookie and worked with the pieces. And I also think it's a point. I just wanted to point out that it's critical. We look at the time of when Yugoslavia occurred. It was like 1996, and that's a situation where like your ostensible reason for NATO is gone. They were supposed to protect the cover stories, protect Western Europe from the invasion, blah blah blah. But they're for Soviet Union, and it's kind of like they were gestating.
You're breaking up really, really bad all along. You're breaking up really bad.
Sure, can you hear better now?
Yeah.
Okay, well, anyway, it just seems like that we need to realize that Yugoslavia may have legitimating NATO after the Soviet Union, just letting Europe know that the U.S. is still going to throw their weight around there also, because, the reason for NATO was gone.
That's a good point. Citizen X.
Hello, Colonel.
Hey.
I was told to come up here and greet you. And I'm Major Blackthorn. I worked in CIC. I'm part of really deep black stuff. I would do counter intel on the CIA up to a certain point when our own organization couldn't get funding or be legitimate anymore. And you were bringing up a lot of valid points, especially when you hit around South America, because that's when I was assigned to go down to Bogota, Colombia, and see what the CIA is doing and verify what we already knew. And it was because they were using planes to ship a lot of drugs into the United States.
Yep.
And so that crossed the lines. They were using military bases, and I got compromised there, and I got injured there pretty badly. I'm surprised I even survived that whole event. And so I'm definitely anti-CIA. They've been a thorn in the side of this government for long enough. I'm really hoping at this moment in time they're getting purged. That would really make me happy.
That would make all of us happy.
Oh, yeah. And so, and I started at Langley at 15. I trained with all those folks up there because I have family and actually friends that are in that sort of thing. But it's compartmentalized, so not every branch of the CIA is absolutely corrupt. Some of them focus on different things, as you know. And I just wanted to thank you for putting all that information out there and point out the drugs, because I was surprised you actually missed that, because that's a big source of their financing.
So I didn't miss it. You may be new here. I have not missed that. I go back to the mid-1940s with Colonel Paul Helliwell and General Chennault and Chiang Kai-shek and the creating of Taiwan as a major drug hub. I've covered all of that. You're absolutely right. When that area, the Golden Triangle, not that drugs still don't come out of there, kind of shifted to Afghanistan, then when we lost to the control of Afghanistan, only then did they begin using primarily Latin America for the drug trade. I've covered all of that. So yeah, this audience is very familiar with the Iran-Contra. I spent an entire week on that, covering Iran and the NATO putting stay-behind units in Iran before the overthrow of Mossadegh back in the 1950s. Yeah, so my summation as far as the drugs are concerned is that it doesn't matter where we've had military engagements. We in the military have basically been a poppy guard for CIA harvesting and of the drugs that are ran into all over the world. We provided the protection, the false flags that created things like Vietnam provides weapon trafficking into that operation where they skim off weapons, sell them on the black market. We're actually over there protecting poppy fields, not actually doing what we're told we were doing at all. And the same was true in Afghanistan. I've talked at length about looking at the opium production in Afghanistan prior to, can you mute your mic? Prior to the year 2000, when the Taliban basically had put out an edict that no more opium was going to be grown in Afghanistan. They spent a lot of money trying to set up farmers growing things like olive trees, grapevines, all kinds of stuff. And all of a sudden, the opium production out of Afghanistan craters almost to nothing in the year 2000 because of their initiatives. And again, I'm not saying the Taliban's good. I'm just observing history. And then all of a sudden, bin Laden, who we know have ties to the CIA, gets put into Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, 9/11 happens. And oh my God, we have to go back to Afghanistan. And what happens to the poppy production? It skyrockets. It goes higher than it was before. So yeah, our U.S. military has been used unwittingly in most cases, although again, you cannot clear the senior level because a lot of them end up in these private military industrial complex. They end up on the boards of these companies that benefit from these destabilization efforts. So yeah, I didn't miss the drug part of it.
Yeah, I guess I did.
I didn't talk about it you didn't miss it in this session, but I have talked about it a lot.
I didn't know the whole backstory on that, but I would assume you would have had that, and you did. So
yeah, yeah. But no, thank you for bringing it up again. It puts the whole thing in context for people that are new. I appreciate it. Miles, go ahead.
It's guns in, drugs out is what I wanted to say.
That's exactly right. That is the point. Oh, and just so that everybody understands the full picture, the wars creates refugees, which create human trafficking. So that's the three prongs. My Gladio 101 talks about a three-pronged wheel, and all of those things happen. The drugs happen, the weapons trafficking happens, and the human trafficking happens. That's where you get all of these, Peter Pan airlift, the Vietnam baby airlift, and then all of these children, young adolescents, and other people go missing in the human trafficking network. And I kind of seal that whole concept up with if it was a wheel, the blackmail operations is the grease that keeps the wheel moving, because they will blackmail people who they set up, being both senior military people, senior State Department people, whoever they need, they will blackmail them into cooperating. So that's kind of the Operation Gladio network that I've discovered with a bow on top of it. Miles, go ahead.
Colonel, I just have one important question for you. If I come visit this winter, is there going to be cake?
No cake. I'm the cake Nazi. You know that.
Oh, no. Okay.
No cake.
Donuts?
No. Not allowed.
I'll still come visit
you. Yeah. If I make an exception, then I'd never hear the end of it from the Cates brothers.
But there will be cantaloupe.
Well, only if you come in the next couple of weeks. Don't be promising shit I can't keep up with, Bridget.
Right. I haven't got my greenhouse yet set up.
Oh, and by the way, I'm not sharing the cantaloupe. My husband even knows that.
I'm loving it.
All right. That was a crazy show. All right. So we're going to delve into chapter 2 of our Invisible Soldier book. And that will be tomorrow. Let me look at the calendar because we have a couple of things coming up. So we've got that tomorrow, and then Wednesday, 4 o'clock, and Alpha on 9:30 on Wednesday. And I'm going to have to get with War Hamster and change our Thursday. So I'll keep you updated on when that's going to be. I may just move it over to Friday. And then Saturday is my grandbaby's birthday. So anyway, lots of stuff coming up this week. This is not a really big
cake for the baby's birthday.
I'm not eating cake, and I didn't invite Brian and Dwayne. Don't tell them. All right. So this is not a really big book. We're going to get through it relatively quick, but it is very explosive as far as the information in it. So you guys have a nice evening, and we will be back here tomorrow at 4. See you then. All right, guys. The Army ran into several blocks to their mission there. Thank you for being in the chat, you guys. All right. Yes, Donnie Vision, I see you. McModern, all of you guys. Thanks for being here. And I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.